This is Free to Exchange, the show where free-thinking scholars, free markets, and, ironically, free public television all meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. The theme of today's episode is crisis. Our first guest has studied the critical role that crises have played in the growth of the American government over the last 100 years. Then, my second guest will discuss the coming debt crisis for the United States. He believes we're headed towards a government default or repudiation of its debt. My first guest is Dr. Robert Higgs. Dr. Higgs is a senior fellow in political economy at the Independent Institute. He is the author of 8 books, including the classic we are discussing today, Crisis and Leviathan. Bob, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me here, Ben.
Well, let's get started with our topic here. And this is an issue I think a lot of people in West Texas are sensitive about, of how big the U.S. government has grown. So give us an idea of this growth in size and scope of government over the last 100 years.
Well, if we went back to the period just before World War I, we'd find, for example, that all the governments in the United States, federal, state, and local together, spent an amount of money that was approximately equal to about 7% of the gross domestic product at the time. Now it's in the neighborhood of 40%. So by that measure, the government is 6 or 7 times larger than it was.
So they take a lot more resources out of the wealth of everybody else than they used to, but even that probably understates this.
It understates it greatly, because if we went back to that same period a century ago and looked at the government regulatory effort, particularly at the federal level, we'd find it was almost non-existent. Not totally. They had created an Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate railroad rates, and just in 1914 they created a Federal Trade Commission to regulate competitive practices of businesses, but there was very little. There was some banking regulation by the Comptroller of the Currency for national banks. That was about it. There wasn't a lot of regulation going on.
Your average American could go through a day in their lives and
the
feel
average
very little.
American never had any contact with the federal government other than the post office in those days. The federal income tax did not go into effect until 1914. So before that, there were no income taxes.
And even then, barely anybody paid it, and it wasn't very much, was it?
After it began in the early years before World War I, only about 1% of all income recipients were liable for any federal income tax, and the maximum rate for people that had enormous incomes was 7%. And I don't know how many people paid in that bracket, but it couldn't have been more than 1 or 2.
And even the lowest bracket starts higher than that today.
Absolutely.
So how did we get from there, more than 100 years after American founding that had ideas of liberty, to something that's gone so far from it 100 years after this point?
Well, that's a question that can't be answered accurately and briefly at the same time, because a great many things happen.
Well, let's shoot the gap and go for the middle. We'll go for semi-accurate and semi-brief.
I think we have to recognize that the nature of the American economy was changing rapidly in the 19th century and the early 20th century. And so the old nation of predominantly farmers and people living in small towns and villages had been replaced by a nation where farmers were a minority and a shrinking minority of the labor force, where industry had grown enormous, where some businesses had become huge and did business throughout the nation. So we'd had a lot of structural changes, as we call them in economics, during that century leading up to, say, 1914. And that meant that people were just living differently. And so their problems of life were somewhat different, their interests, the kinds of political proposals that would perhaps attract them had changed. Far more people were wage earners rather than self-employed people. And all of these structural changes predisposed people, in many cases, to be more receptive to the idea that government needed to play a bigger role than it had played traditionally. But on top of those structural changes, we'd had also developing over a very long time a series of ideological changes, challenges to the old ideas of laissez-faire, of limited small government. Socialist ideas were very well developed by 1914, not only Marxian ideas, but other breeds of socialism had been espoused, and in some cases millions of people had endorsed those ideas and followed them to some extent politically. So we had ideological changes, structural changes, and then we had some decisive political changes as well, particularly the 17th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which provided for the direct election of U.S. senators rather than their election by state legislatures. And what that did was weaken the system of federalism very substantially, and that encouraged centralization of government power, because states were not so able then or so likely to resist proposals for federalization.
So this sets the stage in 1914 or so, or just progressive era generally, for a shift. You've written this book that's now a classic, Crisis and Leviathan. So describe the general thesis then as we go forward from that point to today of how the government's growing and what the relationship with crisis, like maybe the one we just had as well, the financial crisis, we've seen our freedom shrink and government grow. What's the idea with the book?
Well, once the ideological changes I've been mentioning had reached a certain threshold, far more people, especially opinion leaders, were predisposed to look to government not as a last resort, but as a first resort. And what that meant was that if a crisis burst and people were fearful, whether it was fearful of their economic well-being or fearful of their physical safety, they immediately, to a much greater extent than before, turned to government, and, as I say, more likely to the federal government than to their local or state governments, which had been their resort in the past as a kind of last resort. But now far more people had the predisposition to resort to prevailing on the federal government to intervene, restore economic prosperity, protect them from foreign enemies. Whatever the crisis happened to be, people, as it were, demanded much more than in the past that the federal government intervene and set things right. Now, politicians were delighted with this change in the situation because they had always hoped that something would allow them to seize more power. It's a rare politician that doesn't want more power, whether it's for noble ends or the most venal ends. Any politician can do more of whatever he wants to do if he has more power to get it done. So the federal government was very responsive during World War I to the idea that there was a threat from the Germans and their allies, which was mostly bogus so far as the security of Americans was concerned. Germany was not going to invade the United States.
They were kind of busy dug up in France, right?
They had their hands full, and logistically it was impossible in any event. But however that may be, people were apprehensive about the Germans and their allies, and President Wilson did manage to finagle the country into involvement in the war in 1917. And this was followed by government programs to whip up hysteria and ferret out spies, saboteurs, and wreckers of all kinds. And as a result, in 1918, and even beyond there for a year or two, the American people basically lost their minds and set out on witch hunts of various kinds, first against people of German ancestry, then against anarchists and communists and suspected anarchists and communists. And so the federal government was whooping it up to get people to support it in invading people's civil liberties in an enormous way, a way that in many respects has never been equaled since then even. But the government grew hugely to fight the war and to engage on all these struggles on the domestic front.
Okay, but then we've just got a couple minutes left here. The war's over. Government didn't shrink back down to pre-crisis level?
It did not. Although there was considerable retrenchment when the war ended, many people who had been well positioned by the events of the war then decided that they wanted to keep that privilege or that power that they had gained during the war, perhaps by using it in some new mission, or perhaps by using an old agency in a different way. So that we had a lot of work to preserve the wartime emergency actions and the wartime emergency agencies that people had thought were just for war purposes. But it ended up, many of them lasted because they had gained political supporters.
And this is what you see throughout the 20th century again and again, whether the
pattern
Depression,
is the
World
same.
War II.
Whether it's the Great Depression, the Second World War, the period from the mid-60s to the mid-70s when Johnson and Nixon were the presidents, and then more recently in the period, especially after 2008 with the financial crisis.
So here we are here in our last few seconds. Going forward, we've got a much bigger scope and size of government. What can be done so it doesn't keep growing in the future? Or are we bound for this to keep repeating itself?
I think, first of all, people need to understand what's happened in the past. In a way, the events that happened were not so much desired by the mass of the public as thrust on them by interest groups and political insiders, but the people had been prepared, softened up by the events of the crisis. So they were more predisposed to accept these things once they had lived through them during a crisis. So we need to educate people about how such increases in government power come about so that they are not so easy targets for opportunists who always come forth within the government and from outside the government during any crisis. And of course, there are changes we can make in government itself, such as having sunset laws for any crisis legislation. We should never authorize that for more than a year or two at a time. That will discourage opportunists from seizing these new powers during the crisis.
All right, well, thank you very much for helping educate people on exactly these issues, Bob. Our next guest thinks that the U.S. government will default or repudiate on its debt. Most of us would consider that a crisis, but he doesn't seem too alarmed. Stick around.
Free to Exchange is a joint project of Texas Tech's Free Market Institute and Texas Tech Public Media. More information is available at fmi.ttu.edu.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Professor Jeffery Hummel. Dr. Hummel is a professor of economics at San Jose State University. I should also mention that Jeff is a friend and colleague of mine from when I taught with him in my first academic job at San Jose. Jeff's a historian as well as a macroeconomist, and it's this latter role of these areas of expertise that we're going to take advantage of today. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So, you think that the U.S. is headed towards a default or a repudiation even, where it just says we're not paying any of it back, of its government debt?
Of the national debt, yes.
Of the national debt. Why?
Basically, the government has set up an unsustainable combination of programs that are going to cause expenditures are programmed to increase rapidly over the next decades, and taxes are at a certain level that isn't going to cover those. So these programs create what's known as an unfunded liability. And you can calculate the present value of that unfunded liability. In other words, if you take the difference between future taxes and future expenditures, and discounted into the present. And there are various estimates, because it's hard to estimate, but they vary between $50 trillion and $200 trillion.
With a T.
With a T, yes,
Trillion.
$trillion.
So comparing that to today, what's the federal government's debt right now?
The federal government's debt today is about 70% of GDP, making it in the neighborhood of $10 trillion.
So this is just orders of magnitude
Yes.
larger.
Yeah.
And what you're counting there is future budget deficits where the government spends more than it takes in,
Right.
but also Social Security and Medicaid then?
Yeah, Social Security and Medicaid are the main entitlements that are driving the shortfall. They promise benefits into the future. They've been run on a pay-as-you-go basis, which means that if people are going to get returns on the taxes that they paid into Social Security and Medicare, you have to keep funneling more revenue into the system, and therefore the shortfall increases as you go over time.
So if someone's watching and they say, well, why can't we just raise more revenue? We'll have more taxes and cover this.
Right, and the answer to that is that if we look at taxes as a percent of GDP, since the Korean War, although they haven't varied as much as the public thinks. As a percent of GDP, they've remained at about 20% of GDP. And that's an astonishing number when you think about it, because there have been a lot of tax changes, right? Tax rates go up, tax rates go down. The bite out of the economy remains constant. And that seems to be a structural limit. And even if we look back to the point at which taxes were highest as a percent of GDP in U.S. history, which was World War II, they never exceeded 25% of GDP, whereas these expenditures, not counting interest on the debt, are expected to go up to 30 to 35% of GDP. So I don't see any tax increases in the future, and I don't see any benefit cuts, because politicians have no incentive to cut the benefits, and they just keep kicking the can down the road.
So we kind of know that in the long run it's bankrupt today. I mean, I do this with my classes, you probably do with yours. Ask the kids how many of you expect to get Social Security, and very few of them think they are. But politicians are just going to keep putting this off.
Right.
But why, when push comes to shove, won't they cut the benefits or something like that? You think it's going to come into...
Well, I think the government is going to be faced with a sudden crisis, because it will have to borrow more and more money to cover these expenditures. The Social Security and Medicare have trust funds, but they're running down and they're projected to go out of money. Then they're going to have to
the trust funds are treasuries anyway,
right?
right? So
Yeah,
it's
right.
still
And so at some point, people are going to say, look, expenditures are exploding, revenues are remaining constant, and there's going to be a risk premium put on Treasury
risk premiums.
Well, that means that the riskier a loan is, the higher the interest rate you charge. So the interest rate on Treasuries lending will go up, and about 50% of Treasury borrowing is short term, which means it has to be rolled over at the higher interest rates, and that can set off a self-reinforcing cycle, and then the government will just be caught like Greece and forced to default.
And as this process is playing out quickly then, we have the Federal Reserve System though. Why won't the government just say, hey, Fed, bail us out?
Well, there are a lot of complicated answers to that, but the simplest one is that the entitlements are indexed to inflation. So the Fed can't bail the government out except by printing money. By printing money increases the price level. Increasing the price level increases the benefits. So that doesn't solve the problem.
So it would end up in a perpetual inflation spiral.
Yes.
So Zimbabwe.
Zimbabwe, yes.
Well, this doesn't sound very encouraging. I'm sure people watching are like, well, this sounds like it's going to be a big crisis. What do you think?
Well, I think actually the long-run consequences will be good.
Be good?
Be good, yes. Well, first of all, I don't think the government will unleash the Zimbabwe option because once the default kicks in, they can save the currency by just defaulting or repudiating the debt, and I think that's what they're likely to do. And what we need to remember about government debt is that it is like private debt. It has an asset side and a liability side, a lender and a borrower. And the borrower is the one who's responsible for paying the interest and paying back the debt. We all understand that with respect to private debt. With respect to government debt, the lender is the holder of Treasury securities. People think, well, if you repudiate Treasury securities, the government is going to be the gainer, but the government is not really holding the liability. Future taxpayers are holding the liability. And so
each government bond is a promise of future taxes.
Yes.
So
and the present value of the two are almost exactly the same.
And in fact, if you get rid of the
One,
bond,
you get rid of the future taxes.
It's like a tax cut in the future.
Tax cut in the future, yes.
So who's going to be hurt when we repudiate these then? Because some people will obviously be hurt.
Yeah, well, first of all, about 50% of the privately held debt is held abroad, so that'll hurt some foreign governments like China. But I'm not a big fan of the Chinese government, and I don't think taxpayers should be subsidizing the Chinese government. Domestically, people who hold government securities or hold assets that are connected to government securities will lose, but because there's an offsetting decrease in taxes, that means that other assets that have no relationship to the government, including people's future income, which translates into their human capital, will be relieved of this tax burden. So there should be an increase in the value of private assets that approximately equals the decline in the value of government assets. And so, depending on how your portfolio is spread around different assets, you could be a net gainer, you could come out even, or you could be a net loser.
So the way this would work is like if you owned a stock in a company, that stock is being pushed down in price right now because you're expecting to pay taxes on those earnings.
Yes.
But once you don't have to pay those taxes, the stock becomes more valuable.
Yep.
Okay. So.
And also your income, right? Part of this is, now people may not perfectly anticipate their taxes, so the rise in the value of private assets may not be completely equal to the fall in the value of treasuries, but all that means is that people have been relieved of taxes that they didn't know they were going to have to pay.
So I imagine in the short run, there's probably a lot of chaos surrounding this then.
Probably.
What about the long run? And actually, for repudiations in the past, has there been chaos in the short run?
Well, there's been panic in financial markets. I mean, we have a lot of financial panics in the history of developed countries, but developed countries continue to grow after the financial panics continue. Financial panics are more severe in less developed countries. There's one case where state governments in U.S. history in the 1840s defaulted on their debt. Several states repudiated, several states defaulted because of extravagant expenditures on canals that they had made. And actually, not only did the economy continue to grow, but the political benefits seem to have been desirable. The states passed balanced budget amendments. In fact, one of the reasons why state government debt is not as big a problem as federal government debt is that these balanced budget amendments that were passed after the defaults of the 1840s have been weakened, but they are still operating to a certain extent to make state governments more fiscally responsible.
So to constrain the spending of the
Yes.
states. So in the long run, consequences of a U.S. government default, what
Is
you
a
expect
balanced
is
budget amendment with teeth.
balanced budget amendment with teeth. That sounds good to a free market
Yes,
guy.
yes.
So what about the moral implications of this in our last minute or so here? Do you think it's a good thing to default on the treasuries versus other things when you...
Yeah, well, actually, a default on the treasuries will probably mean also an end to the entitlement programs as well, because the whole thing is connected. But as I think that people who paid into Social Security are due something back before anyone who voluntarily loaned money to the government, and unfortunately, the money's not going to be there. So the best thing we can do is to warn people that these programs are going to collapse, that whether they like them or dislike them, whether they think they're a good thing or not a good thing, they're beyond repair, and that they should plan their futures in a way that they don't rely on Social Security and Medicare.
The sooner we start taking responsibility for our own retirement, the less big deal this is going to be.
Yes, the less it will hurt, the less painful.
Jeff, thank you for joining us today and talking to us about this pending crisis.
You're welcome, and it was my pleasure.
On the first half of this show, we learned how throughout the 20th century, each time there was a major crisis in the United States, government tended to grow and liberties tended to contract. But in the second half of the show, we've been considering what might be a crisis coming in our future, a government default or repudiation of its debt, and how that might actually have positive implications for freedom. When I think about some other countries who've done something similar recently, I think of a government debt crisis in Ireland in the mid-1980s that caused them to start reforming their economy and shrinking their government. And it ushered in a decade of marvelous growth in the 1990s. Eventually those reforms tickered off and growth did as well, but certainly the fiscal crisis pushed them in the right direction. India and New Zealand probably fall into this camp too. So maybe, as Professor Hummel pointed out, this could be a turning point for the United States where we stop losing our economic freedoms and start gaining them, even if it does involve some short-run pain. I sure hope so. See you next time.